Hello, my name is Robert Wunderlich. I'm a product manager with Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. Welcome to this session on API management for enterprise applications. Today we're going to cover two main themes. We're going to talk about APIs and how they apply to enterprise applications, and we are also going to cover OCI API management. We're going to delve into the capabilities that we have, some of the things that we've done this past year, and what we're doing going forward. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So first, what is an API? It's an interface. It basically provides a contract for computers to be able to talk together. It also encapsulates, so developers do not have to worry about the implementation of how the API operates. And it connects systems across the web. So our API is new. They're not at all. If you've been working in any programming language, you've likely imported packages and worked with various built-in code that you can use to implement functionality that is secure, and you don't have to repeat the code, but you also don't know what that code is doing under the covers. Web APIs extend this and allow systems to work across the web. So for example, in Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, if you wanted to create a digital assistant, you could do that by just calling an API and working with that digital assistant via the API provided by Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. So what does this mean to enterprise applications? APIs help us to meet new changing business requirements with a lot of the existing systems that we already have by allowing us to create composable applications, by creating APIs that can connect the applications together. You can do this many ways. You could use a pre-built integration with the Oracle integration. You could stitch applications together in a low-code approach, also in Oracle integration. You could have applications that you've written, that you've put together, and you could even write serverless functions. As we move to cloud native, it can be a little bit intimidating. So what we've done is we've created a repository of solutions for you. This includes things like the core requirements, the architecture patterns, and also the technology recommendations, and even 10 design principles. So we consider APIs to be super important. As a matter of fact, they're the modern app development principle number 2, which is to build your app as a suite of services that communicate via APIs. So let's go ahead and break this apart a little bit. So an API is 3 elements. There is an interface or description. This is the contract, what the clients used in interacting with the backend service. If we jump over to the right, we look at the backend service, the implementation. You can implement this in any way that best fits your use case. So as I mentioned before, if you have a number of SaaS applications, you can use pre-built adapters and low-code integration through Oracle integration. Or if you need to write a serverless function, you can use Oracle functions, or you can have a containerized app running that backend. But what do you do to protect those backends? This is where the network and policy enforcement comes in, and we have multiple capabilities in that regard. So you have load balancing, web application firewalls, and also the API gateway. So let's get into what OCI API management is and taking a cloud-native approach to developing our APIs. So basically, it involves security, design, development, and monetization. First and foremost is security, and that's where we've placed most of our focus. We have capabilities of, as I mentioned, as the API gateway, the web application firewall, and even network load balancers, and also network firewalls. You also can get into design, and so this is where you would define the interface of the API as you're working with it, and of course the wide range of capabilities for developing your APIs in the technology that makes the most sense for your use case, and also being able to monetize and monitor. So OCI API management comprises a serverless API gateway. You only pay for what you use when you use API gateway. It also supports many identity providers. So for example, you could use Oracle Identity, but you could also use Microsoft AD Okta or Auth0, any kind of identity provider that is OAuth compliant, but we also have ways to work with other identity providers as well. You can manage it via the console, but you also can work with it through a CLI, command line interface, or the SDK, the software development kit, or the APIs. It's fully API driven, and of course you can use Ansible and Terraform to work with it within your CI/CD pipeline. Compliance is super important, and we've been focusing on making sure that we have compliances like HIPAA, FedRAMP, PCI, and many more. There's basically 28 compliances and counting. You can design your APIs alongside your code. We'll get into that as we talk about the code editor. But what we believe is you should be able to design your APIs and work with your code within the same experience. There's built-in observability that we'll get into as well, where you can observe and monitor your APIs and be able to track the value that they're producing. So let's go ahead and go into the code editor. Code editor is a capability of Oracle Cloud Infrastructure right within the console. If you've used VS Code, you're already familiar with the experience that we have in Code Editor. When you click this button, you can work with all the different types of services within OCI, and you can also develop your code in any kind of implementation, such as Java or Python, and you can generate functions and deploy those to Oracle Functions. You also can work with your API designs, and you can see a side-by-side rendering of your open API formatted design and rendered documentation with that. So the gateway itself deals with policy enforcement. So it's network and access security. It's also authorization, making sure that the client should be able to invoke a particular API. It throttles access to make sure that no client can overconsume the backend services. And it also handles routing, so clients are not aware of the backend implementations. So now I'm going to go into a couple of the different features that we've been working on. But before I do, let me go ahead and touch on a general flow that we have with authorization. This is basically OAuth 2, where the client will go to an identity provider, will authenticate with that identity provider, and receive a token or a bearer token that gives them authorization to call the API. Using that bearer token, the client will call the API, and API Gateway will validate that that token is legitimate from that identity provider. So there is a trust relationship between the gateway and the identity provider. If the authorization token is legitimate, it is correct, and that client is authorized or has the appropriate scope to call an API endpoint, API Gateway will go ahead and allow the request through and return the result. But if any of those conditions do not apply, then API Gateway will reject the request and the backend service will not even have to deal with it. API Gateway has a lot of flexibility in that you can use a different identity provider for every API deployment that is on API Gateway. It's not just a one-to-one relationship between the gateway and the identity provider, it's actually the API deployment. But we've expanded that even further with dynamic authorization. This allows you to create multi-tenant APIs where the same API can come in at the gateway, can actually choose the identity provider at runtime. So this is based on other elements of the request. It can be a header, it could be the host name that the client is coming into. It could even be an authorization claim within the authorization token. So this provides a great level of flexibility. Now, authorization at the gateway can happen as a JOT validation or JSON web token, or it can use Oracle functions to perform a wide range of validations. Before, the authorization token was a single token. It would be a bearer token that was coming in from the client to the gateway, and the gateway would validate that token. We've expanded that capability in what we call request-based authorization. What this does is allows you to include additional elements of the request into the function. And this allows you to perform much more fine-grained authorization requests. So for example, if a particular client is able to call an employee's API and has a particular scope that allows them to call that employee's API, but maybe trying to request an employee ID that they do not have authorization for, you can have the gateway through a function query based on the path parameter and the authorization token to your identity and access management system to validate if that request is legitimate for that specific employee record. So this brings a fine-grained authorization that you can push out to the perimeter in the gateway. Again, if that authorization fails, the gateway would reject the request and the backend system is unaffected. Similar to dynamic authentication or authorization is dynamic routing. This is where you can go and create multi-tenant APIs that can masquerade single-tenant backends. So as the request comes in, the gateway can go and make a choice between which backend you want to use for that particular client and for that route. This can be used in different contexts as well. Say, for example, you have a top-tier customer that you want to route traffic to a backend that is scaled for much higher performance. But you also have some demo and test customers that you want to route to a different backend that may not be scaled for as high a performance, or you want the gateway to actually issue a stock response without even going to a backend. You can control this through dynamic routing and choose between the different backends based on other elements of the request. Another thing that we've completed this year is usage plans. And this is a feature we're particularly proud about and gives you a lot of access and capability how you want to segment your API customer traffic and also monitoring and management. So essentially what it does is it allows you to create what we call API products or API plans. And this is where you can segment your clients or your subscribers and define rate limiting and quota for those groups. You also can prove the value of your APIs, and this is even more important in that you're not just showing that you have an API that's being used, but you're understanding who's using it and how much they're using it, who your top clients are. So let's go ahead and get into an example about plans and how they work. So let's say, first and foremost, I've created 4 plans, bronze, silver, gold, and trial. Now you can call them anything you want. This is just for an example. And I have a number of APIs that are entitled to those plans, and I also have rate limits and quotas. So for the plan itself, say the gold plan, I've defined a 100 requests per second rate limit and 5,000 requests per minute, and I've entitled these APIs, basically paying homage to the Swagger pet store example. So I have cats, dogs, fish, birds, and otters. Now with this, any subscriber that has access to this plan, they can access all of these APIs under those rate limits. So now a subscriber is an entity, an application developer or group that can create applications to invoke the API. They can define clients. So you can have multiple clients associated with a subscriber, and those are the actual tokens or keys that are used when the client is coming in and accessing to identify which plan that they're under. So let's go ahead and go into an example. So let's say we have subscriber 1 that is subscribed to the gold plan. If they call any one of the APIs, cats, dogs, fish, or birds, or otters, and we'll just say otters, they can execute that. And of course, their limits are 100 per second, 5,000 per minute. That's across all APIs. So that's that quota that's being used for that client. If I look at subscriber number 2, however, if I tried to call otters, otters is not in the bronze plan, but it is in the trial plan. And this is what's really powerful is there's a kind of a case default mechanism within the gateway that will allow you to develop fall-through logic. So you may say that you have everything is accessible to everybody, but at different tiers that they have access to it. Subscriber 3, you can see that works there, where if they were to call birds, they would be in the bronze tier because they're not in the silver tier. And then of course, subscriber 4, if the subscriber 4 were to call otters, the request would be rejected by the gateway because subscriber 4 is not entitled to call otters. So there's a number of resources to understand here. First and foremost, APIs are made eligible. The API developer does this, and I'll get into that in a moment. But these eligible APIs can be entitled into plans by the plan manager, or sometimes called the API product manager. The subscribers can be subscribed to those plans, and then of course the clients are defined for the subscribers. So if we get into how to use the usage plans, there's 2 main personas, the API developer and the plan manager. The plan manager can also be the API product manager. So first and foremost, and this is where the real power lies for API Gateway, is that the API developer will decide what constitutes the API key. A lot of legacy API management services require you to have a specific key, or they say that you have to pass the key as a header or query string. But with API Gateway, the person who is building that API and creating the design and the contract of that API will decide what constitutes the API key. When that developer does that, that's also what makes that API eligible. It's a deployment on a gateway, and they make it eligible to be included in a plan. The plan manager can now go and select that API when they're creating their plan. So they're adding that into a plan or making a product as a plan, where that plan will allow users to be able to invoke those APIs. That plan manager will set the quotas and the rate limits for that product, and then they can add the subscribers and of course add the eligible APIs. The real power here, though, is if you have an existing portfolio of APIs and you want to be able to leverage usage plans because you want to track your consumer segments and understand how they're using their APIs. In the legacy systems, you oftentimes would have to go back to all of your clients and tell them that they now have to go and add a header or a query string to their request and start adding a subscriber ID rather. So it's really disruptive because you would have to go back and work with your whole community to kind of change their how they work with your APIs. We would call that a breaking change. With API Gateway, though, you have a lot more capability to keep you from having to do that. So for example, let's say that you have an API client, an API that is using a bearer token, for example. So your users are already authenticating and authorizing for that. You may have the client or client application ID in that bearer token. You could actually use that as your subscriber. And so the gateway can get that off context and use that at runtime. So for your clients who are using your APIs, they would not be affected one bit, but you could start to capture and track the data as to how these different client groups are using your APIs. You also have the control where you can determine how the gateway would handle what we would call a quota breach, meaning you could say when this particular client breaches their quota or their rate limit, I either want the gateway to go ahead and enforce and block that request, or you can tell the gateway, I just want you to log that request. I just want to understand what's going on. So you have a lot of capability. This opens us up into visibility, and we have 3 different levels for visibility for you for API Gateway and your usage plans. First, you can use the console dashboards. This is built right within OCI console. You can use this for API Gateway and usage plans and other OCI services. So you can create comprehensive dashboards to be able to monitor your services. But what if your API is implemented on some other technology altogether? You may have it running on a third-party application server. You could step that up to Oracle Logging Analytics, which has over 200 plus different parsers for all different kinds of systems. So you can tie all these systems together and you can have a complete end-to-end view, including API Gateway and usage plans, which are also supported by Oracle Logging Analytics. We would love for you to use our analytics solutions, but you may already have your own and you want an open platform to be able to work with that, and you can do that. So with API Gateway and the Oracle Public Logging Service, you can use our Service Connector Hub to connect to your logging and analytics system of choice. These are the capabilities that we've created over the last year, and we're really excited about them. Going forward in the near future, we're still going to be focused very much on security. We're also focused on compliance and adding those capabilities. But another thing that we're doing with the gateway is we're expanding its capabilities to act as what we would call a web and application policy enforcement point. So what this means is you can create your web applications and you can use the API gateway in front of that to enforce things like OpenID Connect so that you can define single sign-on for in front of your application to control your user's access, and you don't have to build it separately into every component of your application. This is really valuable when you're moving existing applications that may not support that. So with OpenID Connect and these other features, you'll be able to use API Gateway for both your web applications and your APIs, all within a unified API management solution. So thank you for spending the time with us to discover how you can design, develop, protect, and manage APIs with Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. To learn more, visit us at www.oracle.com/API.